who's watching us virtually. My name is Andryczyk. I administer Ukrainian Studies program here at the Harriman Institute. We have a whole bunch of events coming on this semester. Please consult our website and you'll see more information. Most of them are virtual, but not all, so make sure you check out some exciting things coming up. Today we have a very important event entitled Narrating the War Everydayness by Natalia Otrishchenko. As we know, in Ukraine, there have been many displaced IDPs and refugees and volunteers, and Natalia is part of a team that's doing wonderful work trying to document what's happening. Natalia Otrishchenko is a research fellow at the Center for Urban History in Lviv and an associate researcher at the Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam. She holds a PhD in sociology from the Institute of Sociology at the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Since March 2022, Natalia has led the Ukrainian team within the 24/02/22 5 a.m. International Documentation Initiative. This fall, she is a Fulbright visiting scholar at the Department of Sociology here at Columbia University. Natalia is interested in sociological research methods, oral history, as well as urban sociology, spatial and social transformations after state socialism. And again, today she will be speaking about narrating the war everydayness. After her presentation, we'll have a chance to ask questions both virtually and in person. So please welcome Natalia.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Yeah, thank you all for coming, and thank you those who join us on Zoom and who will listen this event on YouTube, because it will be recorded and hopefully streamed there. Well, yesterday, one of the largest shelling since the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion in Ukraine took place. Russia launched 84 cruise missiles and 24 drones, which fired on the centers of densely populated areas and critical infrastructure. Today, the shelling continues, and part of the region where I am from, Western Ukraine, is now without electricity. Some of the power plants are run out of operation because of the level of destruction. For a few hours yesterday, I cannot reach my mother. And still part of the country is without electricity and without water. So I would like to start with a statement that Ukraine needs air defense system, because it is about our safety. It is about the safety of civil population. And usually we receive support after Russia commits next crime, or some crimes and mass atrocities are revealed. And I think we have to break this vicious cycle and start to think in advance, because every day of delays means new deaths, new destruction, and we need to protect ourselves. So I think it is the key message from my talk today. I didn't plan it, but as the reality which we experience on the daily basis, every one of us is responsible to say this statement to different audiences which we are speaking. So please do support Ukrainian army, because they are on the forefront of Ukrainian independence and Ukrainian future. I wish the project which I'm going to talk to you about today never happened. I wish I could talk to you about the project I'm doing as a visiting scholar at the sociology department, which is related to urban planning expertise. But as social scientists, as researchers in humanities, we have obligation towards the societies which we are part of. And therefore, we have to react. We have to do something which we think it is important for other societies here and now. And therefore, I would like to describe you and invite you to think about the initiative which we launched at the Center for Urban History this spring 2022, after the full-scale Russian invasion. Because as we know, war in Ukraine started not this year, but in the year 2014, when the Crimea was annexed and when the war started in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. It is an invitation. It is an invitation to discussion. It is an invitation to think and ask questions, because we are not in the place to preach, not to the place to lecture. We are in the time of uncertainty. And when we search for decisions which are the most informed, which are the most relevant to the situation where we are living now. Therefore, please feel free to ask questions. Please feel free to reflect with us and think about this initiative and how we as social scientists could be more reflective to the situation which we are facing. Not only wars, but other global challenges that the world is facing now. I'm working at the Center for Urban History, which is an NGO, academic and privately funded. We are working in the fields of urban history, which you can guess from the name of the institution. We are also working in digital humanities. We have a lot of digitized material, so please feel free to visit our website and search for photos, videos, oral histories related to the history of East Central Europe, not only Ukraine, so we have a broader scale. But as we are in Ukraine, we have to be a part of the community and also reflect to the situation around us. We also do public history a lot because we believe that science cannot be focused on itself. It cannot live in the ivory tower. It has to approach the different communities, different societies, different people, and talk and communicate with these people with different needs. Therefore, we have exhibitions, we have educational programs, we have numerous activities targeted to different audiences. And also, like this educational program is also an important part of our work. So academic, public, digital, and educational, 4 key activities that we do at the Center for Urban History. And yeah, it works, good. So we started what we might call a rapid response method or emergency archiving back in 2013, when the event, which was called first Euromaidan and later the Revolution of Dignity, took place all around Ukraine. I remember we sitting at the kitchen with other colleagues and thinking, how can we, as social scientists, as historians, as researchers who are focused on cities, meaningfully contribute to the documentation of the moment while we are inside the moment, while the future is still open and we have no idea how the situation will develop. And together with other colleagues at the center, we decided that we have to react and do what we can do, what we are trained to do. We have to conduct some interviews and conversations with people who are on the streets. So we did 2 waves of interviewing protesters in Lviv, Kyiv, and Kharkiv, first in December 2013, and then in February 2014. So it was something that we have to invent, the methodology of inquiry, which would be respectful to these people, and which should also contribute to a larger perspective, when we will need reliable sources to reflect on this event. And therefore, we conducted these 2 waves of interviewing, and now experts of these interviews are available online after registration on the webpage of the center. So if you are interested in working with sources from exactly the time of Euromaidan and protest, you are free to visit our webpage, register there, and after approval, you will get access to those sets of quotes. For security reasons, we cannot open access to the whole interviews because at that point of time, we did not sign with people a formal lease form, just an oral agreement about the archiving of these interviews. Therefore, this material is available only partially. Later, COVID happened, and it is a quarantine written in Cyrillic on the photo. So we were all in the situation of uncertainty. And I remember this feeling that we had at the beginning of pandemic, that it shouldn't last for a long time. It couldn't be such a huge scale event with such a long-lasting consequences. But also, as scholars, we had a feeling that something important happened. And therefore, we have to document this event as well. So we launched a competition, story competition in the tradition of self-written narratives, which was in Integral Poland, actually, and we somehow bridged these ideas. So you can recall the Polish pattern in Americas. So we bridged the tradition of self-written narratives into the practice of describing everydayness of pandemic, the first months of pandemic. And based on these stories, we prepared a publication, which was ready to be published in spring this year. But also, as you can imagine, nothing like that happened. So the publication was organized around the 5 stages of accepting the inevitable, according to Kubler-Ross. So you all know about these 5 stages, and the invited editor, she selected different stories according to these 5 stages. And I remember writing an introduction to this book when I said something like, the Ukrainian society had an experience, a collective experience, based on which we can build a sense of community altogether, because all of us experience this trauma and all of us somehow succeed to overcome it. It cost us so many deaths, so many losses, but still we managed to succeed. We managed to remain a strong society. And now, when we are in the war, like, how much else I can add to that? How many other things I can say that we as society had to mobilize ourselves in order to survive. So the full-scale invasion happened on February 24th, 2022 at 5 a.m. And it was a break of all the timelines that we have. I remember me sitting at the airplane. I was abroad when the war started, and I need a few days in order to come back to Ukraine. I was back in Ukraine in March 1st, so 6 days, almost a week. I was outside. And I remember me sitting there and thinking, what is the meaning of my work? And how I can contribute somehow, because everything seems so meaningful in the face of the war. Like all your works and all your writings and all your teachings, everything somehow disappears because you don't know how it will develop. You don't know what will happen with your country, with your society. And it was a really difficult experiences for all of us. Also on the level of institutions, we have to think how we as institutions can be helpful. How can we contribute to like very straightforward needs of people? And at the very first days of the war, the center, like first thing that our institution did was securing of our digital materials, because as I mentioned, we had a lot of digitized materials, and it was important to secure that. Secure like the living of the team. So people have to secure their families. People have to know that they have at least basic resources to survive, because no one knows on the first days of the war how far it will reach. And also we had some facilities. As an institution, we have a place, we have the walls around us, and so many people do not have walls anymore. Their houses were destroyed and they had to flee. And therefore we organized a shelter at the center, where we hosted people who were on the way either abroad or who were searching for a more temporary, not a temporal accommodation, a more permanent one. And then when this first reaction happened, we started to think in a longer perspective. Because as I said, war challenges the timeline. Your past is challenged because you have to revisit everything that you did before. And for sure, you have no future. You have no idea what the future looks like. You have no control over your body, no control over the meaningful connection that you have. And what you can do, you can resist somehow. And for me, thinking about the future was a powerful tool of resistance, because it was an important claim that we have this future. We have this future as community, as Ukrainian society. We have the future as an institution. And we also, by doing the research, I think for me, it's a very important contribution to the future. Because when we plan it, we somehow build on our past. We build on the experiences that we have that I just mentioned. And we also think about the future. Because as you might think about the timelines in academia, they are always a very future related, because we have no idea when our works would be published, when they will be accessible to the different audiences. Therefore, it is claimed for the future. So we started to think about the way how we can claim this future and how we can document the experiences, the everyday experiences of the war, and do it in the most respectful and ethically correct way, Because, as you might think, we are entering the field of multiple losses. We are entering the field of really strong emotions. People used to rely on the word of trauma so heavily, but I don't know, is it only about trauma? It is about the different emotions, and we even do not have names for these emotions, I think. And therefore, you have to be really cautious when you start doing any initiative in this heavily loaded field. So let me introduce to the architecture of the initiative. We have to be thankful to COVID, at least to the way that we are now living in digital environments so much, and we can connect to each other even though we are not in the same place. So we started to talk on Zoom with our friends and colleagues in various institutions outside Ukraine as well. So we had like a number of emails and then a number of Zoom calls with the people from institutions, because here you can see the logos of institution, but as you might think, institution is about people. So we were connecting to people from Poland, from Institute of Philosophy and Sociology in Polish Academy of Science, Polish Oral History Association, other colleagues from St. Andrews University in Great Britain, and other colleagues at the Center for Contemporary Digital History in Luxembourg. And all of this brings together a certain architecture. So in Lviv and in Poland, we were thinking about the way how we can record those stories as ethical and as methodologically correct as possible. Our colleagues from Luxembourg, at the very beginning, we started to discuss the safety of data, because it's something really crucial when you think about collecting stories of people during the unfolding war. When so many people have relatives on the occupied territories, people have relatives in Ukrainian armed forces and in territorial defense. And safety of private data is crucial, and therefore we need to secure the safety, and therefore we also needed support from institutions outside of Ukraine who can provide a backup for this data. And also other colleagues from the University of St. Andrews, and I'm thankful to Diana Luna, who is here as well, for providing a valuable support for us in terms of setting a series of seminars with scholars who are working on the topics of violence and trauma and war all over the world. Sociologists, anthropologists, historians, so people who deal with similar problems in different stages of their careers, and who can share their experiences and somehow become the ethical committee for us, with whom we can share our doubts and who can provide valuable comments. So not abstract people who can sit as an ethics committee, but people who do have experience, who do have same doubts and same questions and same problems that we have. The questions of ethical interviewing, questions of data preservation, questions of psychological well-being of the team. So very similar questions with whom we can share. And we had about 16 seminars already with very different scholars who worked on Sarajevo during the siege, scholars who worked with torture survivors from Kurdish people in Turkey, genocide in Rwanda, South Sudan, a lot of connection to the Holocaust testimonies and how they are preserved. So we built this very important geography to which we can relate and on which we can build our own approach. So it is really important to have this support. And it all started pro bono. We do not have any funding for this initiative. And it also provided some certain flexibility, but at the same time, as our local team also included people who are themselves internally displaced scholars, we need to provide support for them. And we are really thankful to the number of institutions which actually provided stipends for those people who are internally displaced scholars and who can pursue their work and who can have at least more or less stable resources in order to live in a different place and to secure their families as well. And also in autumn, we received more support from the House of European History and the Foundation for Polish Science in order to work further and to provide description for the data, and also to plan for a next stage. And I will tell about that later. And you can read about this initiative on the link. You can see all of the names of people who contributed, and also see other academic and advisory boards, because we also established these two bodies in order to support our institution and have some help in terms of providing expertise. And also we are having those people in order we can reach them and have this intellectual support. So you have to start with question why you are doing that all the time. You have to have resources to do that, psychological resources, emotional resources. You have to have a stable place, because actually doing research is a very privileged thing. And we can speak about that as well, because your life has to be secure in order to do research. And then if you are deciding at some point, you have to answer the question why you're doing that. So it is a very tempting thing to think that you could be a therapist. It is a very tempting thing to think that you can become a lawyer and also give the evidence for international tribunals and courts for human rights violations. So setting the boundaries of the role of you as a researcher is very important. And at the same time, I believe in the healing power of storytelling. I believe that we as attentive listeners can provide help for people, because when you are telling your story, you start to put meaning to that. And when you have someone who can be your audience, who would be a moral witness to the storytelling, is a very important act of empowerment. And I believe those people have the rights to tell their stories, even though they are vulnerable people. We could label them vulnerable, but they are sometimes more strong than we think about them. And therefore, acknowledging the agency of those people is very important. And it's a very balancing thing to be on the paternalist position of a scholar who can acknowledge the possible consequences of recalling very difficult experiences. And at the same time, someone who are a gatekeeper for these people and not letting them enter the field, not letting them becoming the witnesses, and contributing to this more informed and more sensitive narrative in the future. So we wanted to document these experiences before these media stories become of the present, because a certain way of narration are established. And speaking about the long-term consequences, we believe that through this initiative, it can develop more ethically grounded archiving procedures as well, and access procedures as well, because we are on such a loaded emotional field. So we have to be even more reflexive than we are in academia usually. So therefore, for me, it is also very important not to think only on this long term and creating the space for people to express themselves, but also thinking about the future of the stories, in what world they will live. And we believe that it could be also a very important resource for academic community and beyond, because when people share these stories, they want to be heard. It's not only about us as researchers who are going to collect the stories and put them in the shelf. We somehow we are obliged to make the stories available to some extent, at some level, but how to do it and when to do it is also the next question. Okay. Taking more time, I believe, but I will hope to finish in 15 minutes. Yeah. The questions from Stephen Sloan, and I would like to build on them in the article, in the concluding article for the listening to, on the Age collective volume. Questions that all researchers that are documenting the events like war or crisis or disaster have to ask themselves. So does it help somehow? Does it help the storyteller? What effect it might have on his or her well-being? How can we do it in the way it will help? So those questions are crucial, because it's all about interaction. it's all about these multiple connections that we establish while we are in this initiative. And thinking about the person with whom you are interacting is crucial. And thinking about him or her on different stages, not only during the interview, but also after. So what will be the effects of disclosure of certain information after those interviews are archived and could be accessed? And also, how does it affect the interviewer? And I could put even further, the other people who are in the initiative, the transcribers, for instance. They're often invisible in these types of initiatives. But in our case, we really included them as much as possible. Every week we had a meeting with psychologists, like a peer meeting where we can discuss our experiences, because it's also about us as researchers. You cannot be an attentive listener. You cannot provide presence in the moment to another person, which is so important when you are exhausted yourself, when you are broken yourself. Therefore, it is really important for researchers to have resources to contribute to this initiative. And that's why it was really important for us to provide this support. We were in the same place. We were at the Center for Urban History. Therefore, we can meet together in the same space. And even having this bodily presence, as we are here all together in this physical space, is important. Not only on Zoom, when we can discuss certain issues, but also in the same space. So with the COVID, we started valuing that even more than before, I believe. And also how it is different and why we are doing this kind of documentation. We have so many stories circulated in media. Do we need other stories? Do we need other sources? Or can we rely on this other documenting initiatives? We have numerous initiatives targeting on documenting war crimes in Ukraine. Do we need something else? And therefore, marking those questions and boundaries of the things that you do and do not do as well is very important. So we decided that we have to focus on everydayness, because it is something that is really omnipresent, but at the same time so invisible. It is so difficult to grasp in this narratives which are so focused on this really heavily experiences of the war, which are also so omnipresent. But at the same time, life is go on. Life goes on, and it is altered so much. So seeing how our everydayness changed is also very important, to see how the life continues. And for me, it's also a very powerful thing, because war cannot broke us. War still influences on us heavily. It is about losses. It is about very difficult emotions through which we are coming, but still life goes on. And catching this moment of everydayness, I believe also very important from the scientific point of view. And also for people speaking about the everydayness is much easier, because through everydayness, you can draw your own line. You can tell the story which you think is important to tell. You're not strictly pushed into traumatic experiences by your interviewers who are documenting war experiences or who are doing the media investigation. You have more freedom to decide what kind of story you would like to tell. And having as much freedom and as much control as possible for a storyteller is crucial in the project like that. And what we try to do, we tried to build on Michael Frisch's idea of shared authority, because it is not about us pushing people into something. It's about us following those people and creating the space for them where they can construct their stories in the way which they think is the more meaningful and the more important for them. And oral history could be done poorly. I'm quoting also Stephen Sloan, even not under the circumstances of the war. So it is really important to pursue the quality criteria as much as possible. So we worked with interviewers who have experience of conducting interviews with people who experienced war, not on the same scale for sure, because no one from us was trained to do interviews during the full-scale invasion. It is something that, like, you're not trained. It is not a part of our curriculum at all, and I understand why. But at the same time, we have some skills which we can mobilize, and we can mobilize effectively in this situation. Oh, sorry for quoting Mary Marshall, she is also here, but I really love this quote because it's time of emergency. It gives you certain energy, which created a sense of community between all parties who are engaged in the process. And it is something which I can really relate to. It is something that we all experienced during the first months of the war. It was such an intense energy between all of us. It is really difficult to operationalize it because it is something that you can really experience with your body. And it is so much the story of your body. The air alarms, sirens, the constant anxiety, the emotional burden of the war and constant fears about your loved ones and the people who are on the front line. That's why this bodily experience is such an integral part of this type of work, and it is often so invisible. But at the same time, it created a resource for you to cope and to do something which you cannot do under the normal circumstances of academic life. And briefly, how we do that. So very general question, I foresee it, with whom we talked and how we select people for this kind of conversations. It's all started from safety, because the safety of your storytellers and of your interviewers is really important when you are in the situation of a full-scale invasion, where the rockets could strike anywhere. And we had a situation like that today, and yesterday we had it. So basically, there is no safe space in Ukraine anymore. But at the same time, it's all about our risk assessment somehow. So we decided that we are not collecting stories under the occupied territories because of number of safety reasons. We are not collecting stories close to the front line because of the constant shelling that happened. It is not a rocket strike, it is a shelling on a larger scale. And we also reflected on the level of air alarms and the possible air strike that happened. So we decided that we are going to collect the stories only basically in Western Ukraine in spring. And when Russian forces withdraw from Kyiv region, we also started to record interviews in Kyiv. So no interviews in Kyiv during the first months, for sure. And only in late spring, we started doing these interviews, roughly a month after Russian forces left Kyiv region. So on this very general level, where to conduct these interviews, where can we record them? Therefore, these were those regions. Basically, we are in Lviv, so we started from Lviv, and we also traveled in the region a bit. So we traveled in other cities in order to talk to people from other territories because experiences there could be different. We focused on stories of people who are internally displaced and also on the stories of volunteers, people whose professional lives changed drastically because of the full-scale invasions. So with the same focus of everyday life, how it changed because of the war. And the interview was developed chronologically. And I will speak about that a bit later, but few more things like we did as much as possible not to engage participants who are emotionally unstable. We are not therapists in order to decide who is stable and who is unstable. And therefore, it was a very important task of pre-interview conversation. So how it worked in my case, if I have a contact of a person who is interested in telling the story or who was invited by his or her colleague via the snowball sample, I wrote a short message on social media and describing the initiative itself and asking when it is possible to call the person. And when the person decides that it is the most convenient time is that, I'm calling the person at that time and describing the initiative one more time in more details and telling what are the possible consequences of telling the story exactly in the moment, that it could be difficult, that it could it could lead to certain displeasant feelings, I'm also sharing possible consequences afterwards that is going to be accessed in the future. And I'm also sharing my uncertainty because I have no idea when the future will happen and what kind of future it will be, what kind of technological developments will be in the future. And I really like the quote from Stephen Narron during one of our seminars, internal seminars organized for this initiative. Stephen Narron is the head of Fortuna Archive for the Holocaust Testimonies. And people who shared their narrations during 80s and 90s, the Holocaust testimonies, have no idea about the developments of internet and have no idea how this technological development might influence the way of their testimonies would be accessed. And I'm sharing the same uncertainty with my storytellers because I have no idea. And I think it is a just way to share your uncertainty as well. So, because we are all in the same field. And when a person agrees, and we met before the interview, so for a third time, I'm describing all this uncertainty. So we wanted to make the participation as informed as possible. But still, we had a discussion about applying a PTSD questionnaire for people with whom we are going to conduct the interviews, but we decided not to do that because we don't want to medicalize our initiative. We don't want to step in the field which we are not professionals in, because we cannot interpret this questionnaires correctly. And also, we don't want to label our storytellers with the label of PTSD or traumatic syndrome or whatsoever. One more time, we want to ensure their agency to tell their story, and we don't want to take the agency from them. So the topics for interviews were shared in advance via social media and during the conversation. So we sent this very general questionnaire so the person could be prepared. And I had interviews when I had no question because the person really prepared the narrative based on those questions. And we have this also very narrator-driven structure of the interview, and we have only like follow-up questions and some questions for people who do need the guidance, because sometimes people ask like, please ask me questions, please ask me now. And therefore our interviewers had a list of questions in order to provide storytellers with some help when they needed the questions to be asked. And the interaction after interview is important as well, because when we have this informal conversation, when we ask a person how he or she felt during the interview, what was the experiences, how can they evaluate it, and what are the plans for the day? Are they going to go somewhere, to the shop, to meet with someone? We wanted to bring them back into the present moment of time, because the whole idea for us was to interview people who had at least some kind of certainty about their nearest future. It was also one of the important criteria for selection of storytellers. But still, what does it mean? Certainty about the future. Still, we wanted to bring people back and to remain in contact with them. We shared the context of psychologists if a person needs some extra help. So we wanted to be sure that their emotional well-being after interview is at least the same as it was before the interview. The Informant Consent is a very important document which regulates our relations with storytellers. And we wanted this Informant Consent to be as informed as possible. It has the multiple places when a person can decide on the level of anonymization, for instance, on the ways how the interview can be used, where it can be archived. So, but the most important thing that this Informant Consent is on the rolling base. So if a person can withdraw the consent at any point of time without any consequences for him or for her. And it is something that we really try to convey as much as possible. So you can stop interview at any point of time. You are not pushed into any topic which you don't want to talk about. And you are free to delete some part of the interview from the archive if you don't want them to be preserved. And it is something that we would like to do in the future about our future steps. We are going to have the second interview with every person with whom we conducted this first one, to approach them. And as we put it, at the moment of time when we can speak about the war in the past tense, we have no idea when we can speak about the war in the past tense, but still we want to have the second conversation, which would be not only documentation of the first months of the war, but rather the full story of a person. We wanted to put it all together in the life story. And we wanted to not to like continue the same story. We want to continue it as well, but we also want to put the first months of the war into a larger frame of person's narration. We want to revision sensitive data with the person because we don't want it to be only our decision to remove some part of the interview. We as scholars can foresee some parts of the interviews which could be considered as sensitive based on our experience in academia. But we want to share this concern with the person. And after sharing, and only after that, if a person decides to remove some part of the interview, we can remove it. So we don't want it to be only our arbitrary decision. We wanted to share this authority as much as possible. And safety of data, as I mentioned at the very beginning, it is crucial. We have to store, and we already store this data in protected digital environment because computers can be hacked, data could be leaked, and it is super crucial to ensure that those people and their personal data is protected. And where are we now? So we collected over 150 interviews already with people who are internally displaced and with volunteers. We are now on the stage of describing these interviews, providing metadata for that interviews based on the document that we have, like diagram, based on the description of the narrative itself. We are thinking about indexing system. We are thinking about tagging system. And we also start to think about the second interview, what it would be about, what would be the questions that we might ask. And the future. We think about future and the sudden shift which happened in oral history, that it is not only about conducting the interviews itself, it is about making them available. And it is also super important not to only record people ethically, preserve data ethically. It's also about access to these materials. It's also about them being visible for different audiences, because it is the primarily function of oral history. And do people motivations to share these stories is to make them available, to make them part of something bigger, of a larger narrative. And therefore, we might think now about this future. And this future, I might put in 3 A letters about archiving, about access, and about analysis. About archiving, we have to decide on the digital environment where all these materials could be stored. And it is something that we are going to discuss with other colleagues in November. We are planning to have a seminar in Luxembourg. Access issue, the key ones, and I do believe they are the most important ones, like when this data could be accessed, where, how, and by whom. So all of these procedures have to be well-grounded, and we have to decide all together in our team, but also with our storytellers, like because we have this discussion now. These materials could be accessed when the war is over and when Ukraine wins. But what does victory of Ukraine mean? And when we can say that the war is over, when it is safe enough to make these stories accessible and available. And for me personally, the most important question is what kind of narratives are we going to produce based on these stories? And who is going to produce these narratives? Would it be only scholars? Would it be educators? Would it be people themselves? And I would like some of those storytellers come at some point of time to this archive and start do something based on their stories themselves. Because for me, it would be the most important point of empowerment when they are themselves the ones who are relying to the stories and building a collective narrative based on that. How make the stories visible? It's also a very important issue. Should it be only academic articles? Should we go beyond academia into the field of public history? We are working only with audio stories, and this is something that I forgot to mention. But we are not recording video interviews because of the multiple reasons, and I can talk about that a bit. But how we can make the stories visible when we have only the voice of a person? We might think about different options. We might think about podcasts, about exhibitions, about very different ways. So for me, it is the most important, the future of these stories. And for me, it is also a story of agency of Ukrainian people who are telling their stories in the first person from the very first days of the war. And it is a strong claim for us. We are now created the sources. And based on these sources, we can pursue our subjectivity further. And I really would like it to be a base for us to tell the story of the first months of the war in Ukraine from this very local perspective and from this very human perspective. Thank you so much, and looking for your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Fascinating to hear how in such a short time how you're able to use your past expertise to kind of reorient and work with the situation at hand. And we're opening up the floor to questions online as well as here. I have a question for you. You detailed to us how carefully and well planned you were in approaching the interview subjects, documenting and up to the end. My question to you is, as you were conducting this, were there any adjustments that you had made, things that you had planned and this, that wasn't a good idea. Maybe we should switch gears and do that because it was so detailed. I'm wondering if you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah, sure. The field phase of collecting interviews lasted from mid-March 2022 till roughly mid-September. So 6 months. And during the 6 months, the situation itself developed drastically. So for sure, we have to adjust somehow on different levels. I briefly mentioned this idea of PTSD questionnaire. It came somewhere in April. So we were thinking about that. And luckily, we did not accept this idea. But it was something that we wanted to introduce at some point. And based on the discussion that we have within our team, we thought that maybe it is not the best idea that we can have. For sure, we have to adjust questionnaire. We did not have a separate questions for volunteers at the very beginning. So the whole idea was to have the same questions for volunteers and people who are internally displaced, even though the experiences are quite different. But as we focused on everydayness, for us, it was important to see how it shaped not only like the whole life of a person, but also a life of a person who decided to dedicate himself or herself to helping other people in very different ways. So we decided to have a separate block of questions for volunteers also somehow during the midsummer. So we also adjusted this questionnaire as well. First, we started interviewing people only in Lviv. So it was the whole idea to have it in Lviv first. So it was really focused on one location. Then we decided that maybe it's good to have other spaces included as well, because the experiences of people who are staying in Lviv could be quite different from experiences who are in different regions, because Ukraine is quite diverse in this extent. People who are staying in Bukovina region or in Transcarpathia or in small towns. Because Lviv is roughly 1 million people now, because before the invasion, it was about 800,000. So it's a big city close to Polish border. So it is one experience, like it is close to Romanian border or to Hungarian border, might have different experiences. Also, scale of the city might have influence. People who are staying in villages have also quite different experiences when you are in a small, very small community. So it all somehow influences on the way how we adjust to this collection of stories. And for sure, I believe it is also part of reflection when you are constantly reviewing and thinking on the ways what you can add, what works, what does not work. And it was part of our discussion. We discussed like the word sample is very heavy word for this context, and it's a word from quantitative tradition more. But still, we were discussing like with whom we are talking. Maybe we have this group underrepresented, this overrepresented, but we had an Excel table where we put some information about our forthcoming interviews and thinking whom we need to talk more. So we adjusted in the process a lot. But it's all about teamwork. And I have to stress it with caps lock. Like it's all about teamwork. It's impossible to do a project like that when you are alone. And we had such a big structure that I described you. We have this international support from other colleagues from abroad. We have like a local team. We have support from psychologists. So it's all raw, and because of that, it is possible to do the work on such a scale as we did.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, you can see how it would be important to do as things are developing anymore. And it's interesting you're saying, you know, you have a set of questions for internally displaced people and for volunteers, and certainly a lot of displaced people became volunteers too, so you get to use the same questions. Any questions for I know we have several students and scholars in house today that can certainly benefit from the work of that you're doing. Yes.
So first of all, thank you so much for the initiative and sharing with us your experience. You mentioned that there have been other like similar initiatives in other countries, like in Rwanda, in Bosnia, in Turkey with Kurdish population. So I wonder, how do you collaborate with them? Like, can you explain more about it?
Yeah. So. They're not exactly initiatives. There were specific scholars who worked on different contexts, and some of the scholars do represent initiatives, but they're like different, right? And for instance, today we had a seminar with a scholar who worked on and works on Polish-Belarusian border, and who focused on this refugee crisis which happened there with their initiative. So I believe like the most important cooperation that we have, that it's sharing information and concerns and questions. So on the level of communication, it is the most important for sure. And this set of seminars were designed for us to share this information about our initiative and also to learn more from experience of other people. And they were similar, but they were also different in very many levels. For instance, on the level of the distance between the event itself and the moment when it was studied or documented. So usually this difference was quite big. And also, we are learning from this experience, but at the same time, it is not quite the same as ours. So it's also important to see where you can take some ideas and adjust them to your initiative and when done. So there are numerous similar initiatives in Ukraine now. So we are not alone documenting, and I also have to put it very clearly. So there are multiple initiatives all around Ukraine now documenting the war on very different levels. Starting from documentation of the war crimes with collaboration of lawyers. And by the way, we also communicated with lawyers with our initiative because it was important to understand the whole field which we are entering and some of our possible obligations that we might have, because we are collecting information from people who might be victims of war crimes. Also numerous documentation initiatives with videos, numerous initiatives of people who are coming exactly to the front lines, initiatives with like who talk to people under occupation as well. So there are so many initiatives which I even don't know about. but they are still existing. And at some point, I think it is important to connect all together, because what we can do, and the most important thing that we can collaborate, is sharing. And because on the level of metadata and having like a collective archive of all of the archives that were established in Ukraine during the first months of the war, it would be super difficult. Because even now, when we are trying to have this one system of metadata, it's a very tough task. But knowing about each other and seeing each other, it's very important, because it is about like common good that we have, because through communication and through learning from each other, we can do a better job. We can ourselves become better professionals, and yeah, learning from each other. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question here, please.
Yeah, Mary Marshall Clark. Thank you for this. It's so inspiring to the field of oral history. I work in oral history here. And thank you for also the walk where we talked about similarities and differences of longitudinal work and projects that have to do with war and trauma. I was so in awe of how you've done this. And I think I just want to say that it's really important for those of you who care about this project to ask the questions that, or talk with her about the things that she's much worried about, especially about the second phase, because this work is virtually exhausting. And it's really hard to lead it when you're also in the middle of it and responsible for it. So I just want to say that to begin with, and to thank you again for doing it. I noticed that you use the word story and storytelling. And I just want to dig into the differences between that possibly in narrative, only because, as Svetlana Ilichevich has shown us, sometimes the oral history of the war produces fragments as well as stories. And so that's really interesting, I think, to see how you're going to look back on these and see, especially as you go into the second round, and see where the fragments are and how you're going to ethically deal with that. Would it be too painful to bring that up? How will you think about writing about that? We know through the work of Alessandro Patelli, who's the great, oral historian of Rome, that understanding fragments and confusions and dissociations, especially referencing psychology, are just as important to understanding the lived experience of suffering in this kind of crisis as are intact, so-called intact stories. So it's too soon for you to be thinking about that in a way, and yet at the same time, you must have permission to do so, because these stories are not going to be linear and cohesive.
Yeah, I don't think that it is too early to think about that. It is never early. I'm like, yeah, you are totally right, because from these stories that we heard already, some of them are really fragmented, really fragmented. So it's rather like a set of pieces put together, like so. Yeah, and we had conversation with transcribers about the stories, and it's also super interesting to see how interviewers and transcribers can work together, and how they can see the same narrative and the same interview from different perspectives. Because when you are inside situation in this flow, for you it might be not so obvious how fragmented it is. Mm-hmm. And when another person approaches this recording and start to type it, and I had like people somewhere really struggling with like putting all together, because they don't know, like the time is shifting all the time, like and especially these pronouns, like no one knows about, like who are they talking about when they using pronouns like they or we or them. Yeah, and like and it just like the person describes his or her imagination using these pronouns, and understanding who are they in this specific situation, or who are we in this specific situation, could be very difficult task, and for researchers as well, who will step into this material at some point. So you're totally right about like us thinking about the way how these fragments could be meaningfully entangle into a story that we are going to tell as scholars. Well, and it's also very interesting to see how in different time periods people can have more or less fragmented stories, because the first interviews were more fragmented, at least from my experience, than the next one. The next one are more like more balanced in terms of coherent story, it's very important to have the second interview for me as well, because to have it all together, to have it like a story of one person but told in different time perspectives. And I think it will also help us to work with these fragmented parts more carefully when we have like another iteration of the story. But also thank you for sharing your experience. And I know how difficult it would be to find those people. And it will be the completely challenging task for us to reach all of these people whose life trajectories might be so different. Some of them might left the country and never return. Some might return to the occupied territories, if there would be still occupied territories. I hope there would be now at some point. So, and finding those people, some might change their mobile phones, have no access to their social media. So I hope we can record as many as possible, but I'm sure it will be not the same amount already now. I'm acknowledging that.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
I'm not coming at this as a sociologist, but the everydayness, the material that you're collecting is really the direct and immediate experience of victims in the sense that they did not initiate the behavior that resulted in the war, but were immediate victims of the war. I have a problem, two-part questions. First of all, are you including volunteers that are military volunteers or just civil volunteers? And secondly, I could see taking Jeffrey Sachs's view of the war, in which sometimes the victim is the cause of the war rather than being the sufferer of the action. There's a timeline of victims. Immediately came, a little later on to a little or Lviv. But now we have victims defined differently. If you're looking at Russians leaving Russia to escape the war, the definition of victim is still there. It's just the type of victim. I understand that I'm 100% Ukrainian, but as a scholar interested in philosophy and political science, the data you're collecting, the mosaic that you're going to build, is going to be partial.
Of course.
Of the history, which can be you're concerned about a public narrative, but that public narrative can be as prejudiced as the one that the government will give what you're collecting, and that's from an intellectual point of view, that's difficult to overcome.
Yeah, I had to say it very clearly. Also, every initiative is limited, and clearly stating the limits is also very important part of communication of initiative. And I also started with this described it briefly as a recruitment procedure that we are not talking to people under the occupation or people who experience heavily shellings for the whole time, who have not been in Kharkiv, for instance, or we are not talking to military people as well. For security reason, first of all, because the data from military is considered heavily sensitive, could be also classified, and we don't want to step in this field because of the multiple concerns that we have. And our story would be limited for sure. We are not talking to people who experience rape, for instance, a woman who can experience, or man, or we are not talking to kids. We are talking only to adults. We are talking to people who have resources to live and who are more or less stable in their position, who can share their stories, because there are a number of people who cannot share their stories now. And there are also a number of people who will never be able to share their stories, and their narratives will never enter the public sphere. So it is also like we're completely acknowledging the limits of the stories that we are going to collect, and as well the limits of the narrative which would be produced based on the stories. But talking about this word victim that you used, and like the majority of people with whom we talk, like it's not a story of victims. They are really angry about the war, but it is a story of very strong agency of people. The story of survivors, I will say rather, not a victim, but survivor of the war, because they managed to make a decision. They managed to pack their whole life into one bag and take their kids and cats and plants and move to a completely unknown future. So it is a story of very strong people, and it is a story of survival, and also a story of caring, because it is so much about people being able to create the network of support to each other and rely on these networks, which are like Granovetter's weak ties to a large extent. So not only families, not only friends, but like acquaintances, people from whom you know, like just briefly on social media. And based on this connection, people do establish their everyday life on the new place. So I would not say victims in this case for sure. And we are in the field where words do matter so much. And I am so much struggling with finding the words myself, and especially translating the words, because like we are in this environment where like words in Ukrainian and words in Russian and words in English, that could be different words, and they are not directly translatable sometimes. So I am so struggling with this like field. I'm moving in the language because language could be so violent. Language could hurt so much, and finding the path, which could be like also very difficult path, and trying not to hurt with these words. And the other thing that I would like to share, also your question made me think about that, like this double pressure that we have in this type of project, like the pressure from academia to produce a valid and well-grounded result, and the pressure from your humanity-based feeling of not harming other people, of doing something which will produce as less harm as possible, and therefore maybe sacrificing some of the quality. And what is quality in this case? I don't know, but maybe it is a chance for us to rethink equality as well. So this double pressure that we experience, it's very heavy, and I can feel it so much. Not harm people, be as rigid scholar as possible, and balancing between those two, and maybe finding some other way. I don't know. Like it is so many story of questions and of answers.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Natalia. I have so many questions for you, which I won't bore everybody else with now. I think I really admire the way you talk about this responsibility not to do harm, and I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind for those of us who are thinking about how to research what is happening in the varying ways which will approach that, and that's something I'll talk to you about in private. And just a note on the language, I found it really interesting how you used the word narrator to describe, as far as I understand, to describe the people who you were interviewing. I thought that was it was really interesting to use that there. My question, I have two questions, and feel free to ignore whichever one you like in the interest of time. From doing research in Ukraine, I noticed how very much during ethics training and things like that, I was like, don't contact people on social media, don't use social media, be very careful about friending people, but also realistically, pre-full-scale invasion, you ended up contacting people on Facebook and social media. And I imagine now it's perhaps even more important. So I wondered how you dealt with some of the ethical implications and issues that arise from using social media to contact people. And my second question is, what are some of the ways in which your narrators responded to the opportunity to participate? Was there really like a willingness to talk generally? Was there kind of like mixed reaction to it? And did people understand everydayness in the way you anticipated as research, so that people really kind of like make this term their own?
Thank you. It's actually three questions.
Yeah. One, sorry.
No, thank you so much, because like this contact on social media was like the first stage for us. So it was not like not sharing any important information and private information on social media. It was like just very general description of the initiative. And based on this contact, you cannot know for sure if person agrees with something, right? So in this terms, I think it could be safe, but we should not ticket it so much, because maybe other narrators, they are not people from military, not people who are we also had so many discussions about interviewing volunteers who work with military, because it's also like stepping in the field of possibly classified information, people who make drones, for instance, or who are like doing this type of activities. For sure, there had to be a protocol for that, especially when you are in the war-affected society and the war is going on. But basically, we tried not to share very private information on social media, and we do not push anyone into this study. It is not a situation when you're working with the witnesses of the Second World War, when you come to the village and you have only 3 persons who were born in 30s and who can barely remember the time, and you are really pushing those people into sharing their narratives. That's how it works, at least in this type of scholarship. But there you're not pushing anyone. We advertised on social media that we have this initiative. We used to have private networks, and every one of us has different networks. So we are not only scholars, we are also people with different hobbies and people from different locations. So we can mobilize very different circles of people. And we also rely on snowball sampling. And I also have the whole chains of people when one person invites another person and another person. So it worked really well in this step. And for me, it's also a very good sign when you have the snowball. And when someone advises someone to participate in your study, it means that probably it went well. So that it was not such a bad experience, and you ask other people to join it as well. And understanding of everydayness, well, for sure it's very different. And the specifics of this type of research, that you do not have so many anticipations at all. You are open to so many different scenarios, and it is not about research questions. It's about you creating just as broad field as possible. And for me, it's proving to be such a good strategy, because so many different things emerged when you have this opportunity to create this space, so many issues about identity, about social networks, about different hierarchies that people establish, about perception of space, perception of time, about different imaginations that people have about the state and responsibility. So many different things could be explored based on these materials. That's why I think that everydayness is such a broad notion from where you can just dig different questions in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Please.
Oh, thank you for this wonderful presentation. It's incredibly inspiring. I was curious. I'm an anthropologist, so I definitely I've worked in Russia before, and I was curious, has your ongoing work illuminated any potential shortcomings in standard social science research procedures, especially when it comes to ethics and data security? Is there anything that, you know, regardless of where they're working, social scientists can do better than how they have been doing?
We can have a separate seminar on the topic like that. Because the board shows so many things, how things work well and not well in like normal conditions of social science. Like, yes, because the procedures itself are developed in the situation when you do not have a very straightforward challenges, either to security of your storytellers or to your team or to your institution. So like, yeah, so science is a privilege. It's really like a privilege when you have stable resources, when you have a stable future, when you can plan in advance, when you can apply for a grant, wait for decision for a year, and then start to implement your study, do a literature review, state your question clearly, do your field work, adjust it through the ethical committee who might never have experience of doing something like that in the region. And then you do your field work, and then you write your paper, and then you review the papers. Like the whole practice itself. Oh, publishing. Sorry of that. And also reporting on the project. Like, so the full circle, it's like it's really established for the normality. And stable future, stable funding, stable institutions. And then you are in the situation when everything collapsed. Of course, completely different. And these ethical procedures, which we use usually just like a keyword, you have to put them like security of the narrator. I will secure my narrator. And what does it mean? Like usually people just put this word because it's something that you have to add into your application. But here, these words are meaningful. Like the words become flesh, and they have really strong consequences. And here, all your decision matters. And sometimes the result, like the outcomes of your decisions, are so visible here. Like, and this time scope between the decision and the way when you see the outcome is so short sometimes. So you have a feedback quite soon on the things, and you have to train your imagination so much in order to foresee the possible developments and possible outcomes on different levels and different scales, from your personal life and the lives of your storytellers to your institution, to the project, to the state. You have to think about this political context and how it will develop. We have no idea how political context will develop. And the situation in Rwanda is quite telling, and how easily it can change. And this 9/11 project is also telling, like so many things are telling us, like when you do this emergency scholarship, how much it tells you about the way how the normal scholarship works, and how many things are on us when we do this type of research. But at the same time, like the feeling of importance of your work is so visible now. Because sometimes we are struggling in academia because like, well, why we are doing things, why we have these questions, why is it important for society? But here you have these answers very straightforward in front of you. So the feeling of urgency, it brings this energy, which fueling this type of project so much. Oh yes, and it's difficult, and at the same time, it's the only thing that you can do.
Okay, there's 10
I
minutes
just have
left.
like teeny tiny comment. First of all, I'm from the sociology department, and we're very happy to have you.
Thank you.
And it's incredible how much you have done in such a short period of time, in such circumstance, and how many things you had to think through while you were doing it. I just want to say welcome, and I hope that we will be able to kind of continue.
Thank you. I'm joining Scott every week, so I'm at the department anyway. Yeah, so let's talk.
Very lucky.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm joining also. Welcome. I'm also from sociology department here. I have actually a question which you addressed in part already. Talking about the people that you have interviewed so far, and you said it's about 150 persons, right? If I making something up. In terms of some other socio-demographic markers, right? You mentioned the nationality of it, that you moved, right? You expanded from only urban, doing some also suburban, people who live in the villages and so on. But I'm more curious about to know about the age, the social background. Obviously, there are people who have resources to pack up and move. Whether there are differences, whether it's sort of selective, preemptive self-displacement, or the pressure of time. Should we have to leave? If you see some differences, you know, on that type of level, and also a type of a political spectrum, if this is something that you consider at all when you talk to people. And I know it's sensitive, but I'm almost curious, like whether all those things play into the sample demographic overall, and something that you think about, you know, and the framework that you work within.
Yeah, so when we started, we do not think about any social demographic groups which we are targeting. So we were thinking about like basically people who have resources to speak and who are in more or less safety condition, like with this more or less secured future. So we had these two basic criteria in order to select people. And at the same time, we started to think about this like soft quotas that we might apply. So definitely male and female. So in Ukraine, we have both groups, because if you think about global displacement, they are mainly women with kids or elderly people, because in the second day of the war, men under age 18, 60 are not allowed to leave the country. So if you think about this global perspective, that would be mainly voices of women. But here in Ukraine, we can speak with both genders. And we also were thinking about different age groups. It's not like the mean age is about 40 years in the group, like the younger is 18, because we do not speak with children. So people have to be adults, and in Ukraine, adult is 18. And I think the older person is in mid-70s. So like this group, we were thinking about people from different regions. So not only people who are displaced from certain areas. So we tried to have people who come originally from different parts of Ukraine. And it's also interesting to see how they change with time because of the situation in the front. So first we have more people from Kharkiv and Kyiv region, because they were heavily attacked there, from Taus, Mariupol. And it was like the whole story around Mariupol. We have a lot of people from Mariupol. And when the active war started in the eastern part, in Donetsk and Luhansk region, and started to pursue further there, we had more people coming from there as well. So it's interesting to see how geography also changed with the time. But what we tried to do, we tried to have like different regions covered. Also, we tried to have different professional backgrounds of people, because it was so easy for us to have academics, like from this very general, and we have a subsample of displaced academics. So in case some of you are interested in the way how Ukrainian scholars adjusted to the war, we have a subsample of this group of people. But we don't want to have it only academic stories, but we try to have people from different professional backgrounds as well. For sure, the sample is a bit skewed, like it's one of the limits, but different professional backgrounds. And in terms of volunteers, we try to talk to people in different areas of volunteering. So not the ones who are like only providing food or only having medical supply, but try to have it diverse. So I guess diversity was one of the key words that we used while we were discussing our samples. So we wanted to have as many different experiences as possible covered. And about political spectrum, well, it was not something that we discussed, but it is something that is present, because we have very different people, because of the region and because like of the different backgrounds, people are from very different ideological spectrums, I think. And in terms of language, it is also very interesting, like because This part of country was bilingual, or mainly people were from Russian-speaking groups. So we have interviews both in Ukrainian and in Russian. And per se, it was also such an interesting thing to see how language plays here. Like some people who decided to make this testimony in Ukrainian, even though they are Russian-speaking, because for them it is a statement of history, and they don't want to speak on the language of the perpetrator. And some people who still speak in Russian because it's easier for them to express their very difficult emotions. Some people switch different languages. Some people use different words of different languages. So for language scholars, it would be an amazing set of documents to see how the language works under this type of circumstances. But we also do not focus on the language itself. And person had an opportunity to speak the most convenient language. And it was something that we also try to convey while we were recruiting people.
Okay, we have 4 minutes left, so
This Natalia, this is very short. Thank you very much. It's really impressive talk, and I'm not sure if this counts. I've read it some years ago, so still I think it's a challenge. I'm really lucky to have you. I sent an email about my project, and when I was looking at those sex slaves during World War II, and their oral history data are collected in 9 different time warps. So I'm thinking that our experience of daily war experience, there must be some time frame. Like if it's early in the war, their records of war could be very different from later in the piece. I'm just curious about your design of the research, how to incorporate those time facts, those experiences for them to, rate this experience.
Like a story is always told from this current point of view, and all the time you at your present position return to your previous past, and depending on what position you are now, it will be a different story all the time. And my story today might be different from my story I will tell you last week before the shelling on the mass scale. So for sure it will be a different story. And that's why for us it is so important to have the second interview, and maybe even more. I don't know. Maybe we'll have like a whole round of interviews, like a panel study with the same group of people, trying to talk to them like in 5 years, in 10 years. Like the key issue is that, like, unlike the Holocaust and the Second World War interviews, which were for such a long time a model for us in order to study violence and trauma, those interviews started to be recorded en masse in 80s and 90s, when those people were on this very late age. And therefore, it was not possible on the large scale to talk to people in such a different time periods. Even though there were interviews with the same person, like in a few years. But as I said, like the average age of our cohort group is 40 years. So it is the war of my generation and of the scholars of my age. So it would be possible for us to conduct those interviews in different point of times. And for sure, we will have so many different resources and stories being preserved. That's why I'm so concerned about the narratives that will come based on the stories. So it is the first stage that we create this data, we create these archives. But what will come next? What kind of materials and what kind of questions will scholars ask when they come to this archives? I don't know. But for sure, it is important to have these different interviews at different time scopes, because it will help you also to see how memory works, and also to see how the environment changed, and how this political climate change, what would be more important to say out loud in different point of times. So because it is such an interesting field to work in. It opens you so many different ways, but it's also so difficult, especially when you are inside the event yourself.
yeah, thank you, Natalia. It's really interesting. Your lecture, especially interesting, in just because of the time aspect of the work you're doing. Because I know in the near future we'll be having a scholar presenting their research on Ukraine, and using the data that's being collected now, possibly in this room, and hopefully others will be contributing too. So thank you so much for that. It's so important to see how this is being collected now. Thank you so much for your wonderful questions. And let's thank Natalia.
Будь ласка, я просто перебрала час, але це одна річ, яку ми навчилися.